do this. I'm doing record on this computer, so I'm curious whether or not it's going to tell me where it's saving that file to at some point. But in any case, so tonight we're doing a study. It's by request. I asked if anybody had anything to send it over to me, and so I got a couple of requests. One from Lou, a couple from Lou actually, and then one from Enoch, and there was some overlap sort of in the interest. Both Lou and Enoch had expressed an interest in some eschatology related material. And so Enoch had sent over a couple of links to some YouTube videos on the two witnesses that I checked out the other night. Both of them about an hour long by two, I think, pretty different sources. One was sort of a group chat, and the other was a guy presenting his point of view. And so what I want to do is our points of view, our studies on the two witnesses really kind of are peppered throughout different studies that we've done online. And so I want to kind of do is collect some stuff together and do a look at it over the course of the next week or weeks or whatever it's going to end up being. It'll be probably a while. And we can go pretty deep on this. This is one of those things where I find there's a lot of interest and intrigue. One of the videos that Enoch sent over, the guy raised the point, the host raised the point. Look, we talk a lot about important biblical figures throughout the Old and New Testament, but there isn't a lot of dialogue in the church today about these figures referred to in the book of Revelation as the two witnesses. And so that was his purpose, was to spend a little time talking about it, of which they spent about an hour in that video. Maybe they could have spent more. I found that over the course of the hour, they were running out of new material and new points to discuss. I find generally that there's a pretty basic core of discussion about the two witnesses, and then that pretty much reaches the extent of it within certain conventional theological points of view. And I found that by contrast that there's, I think, quite a bit of depth that we can glean about the two witnesses, both from looking at the book of Revelation itself and studying it, as well as the precedent material that comes throughout other parts of the scripture. And so what I'm going to do starting tonight is just deal with some basic questions about the two witnesses, some of which were covered in the videos that Enoch sent over to me, and just kind of give us an opportunity to consider for ourselves some of these issues dealing with basic questions of identity, and then we'll build from there. The stuff that we're going to talk about tonight is pretty understandable, I think. It's pretty within reach of most people to get to these questions. I don't think enough people consider all the information. There's a sort of laziness to people's approach to studying scripture in general, and unfortunately it sometimes affects this topic as well as others. And so people will come to the sort of the precipice of some important questions and then kind of answer it in a very shallow or almost effortless way when there's promptings yelling at us to look deeper, look at some other things. And so I don't think we're going to, over the course of the study, come up with anything that's going to be controversial particularly, but there is going to be some stuff that I think people just don't see that might be presented for us in scripture. And I do want to underline again that I'm not going to be making any of these arguments. Very few of the arguments am I going to be making in a conclusive or dogmatic way. I'm just going to be saying, I think there's some really good scriptural information that could lead us to some additional details and information about the two witnesses and their work and their role. So with that said, let me just pause for a second. Does anybody, before we get into the study tonight, does anybody have any particular questions or areas of interest on this subject? I know I'm springing it on you, that you would want to see addressed or maybe come around to at some point during the course of the study? Anything in particular? And if you think of stuff tonight or in the weeks ahead, let me know. Go ahead, Luke. Yeah.
What I've thought of is that in some apocryphal writings, like Sirach, the wisdom of Sirach, it talks about the two witnesses. I think it's at the very end of his book, which is an apocryphal writing.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. if you could send that
I
over
think
to
it's
me.
Sirach 51. I'll send it over to you. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to have that as part of the conversation, along with anything in particular that you questions or thoughts you have about that you want to share or see discussed. Yeah, that's good. Okay, Enoch.
I would just add to that too. And thanks for doing the study. And I'm sorry, I guess I should have sent the video to everybody. I just was sending it to just you because I wasn't sure if we were going to do it or not. But maybe afterwards we can send it out if people wanted to see it. But there were just some questions I've been thinking about the two witnesses a lot, and I've just seen some of that stuff come up and questions I had. I think I know what I believe in terms of the scripture-wise, but this whole discussion about whether or not, and you're probably going to get into it. I don't want to go too far into it, but just that's what my question was coming up about. Is there a parallel? I believe it's going to be two literal people, but is there some other second component with that, like the house of Israel and the house of Ephraim, or Gentiles and the church together, something like that? But so that's why I was just kind of, there's been this kind of buzz. Some people starting to talk about that, as I believe some people are starting to be more interested in the end times. So I'm glad we're sticking on the eschatology type of topics, because I'm hearing people from my clients and family members, and people are just saying, like, man, I mean, obviously you turn on the news, you can't help but think that, wow, things seem to be headed in a different direction. So it's got people thinking, and the two witnesses, like you said, don't get talked about a lot of times. Some general stuff, but not a lot. But they play a big, significant role, I think, in terms of the last 7 years or whatever of the Daniel 70 chapter. So I'm looking to hear more about what your viewpoints on those is. So
sure. And some of the stuff that was in the videos will be what we're kind of going to tackle and take a look at up front here. We certainly can send those videos out if you want to other people. I intend to cover the points that they cover more succinctly, because I do think there's just a lot of especially in that the table discussion where there's 2 or 3 guys talking, there's a lot of just kind of talking about the same things. The other guy took his time to go through his point of view on a pretty important question, but I think it can be done more concisely and even more thoroughly than I think sometimes gets done, or at least let's say with more substance than what we can do. I will say this in fairness to the Christian point of view about the two witnesses, which I think is fairly, what's the word, brief, or you might, so as to sound, not insulting. It's just that they don't have a lot on these guys. We know it's going to be, they're going to seemingly be important figures, but there's really not too much we could make out other than what appear to be plainly stated details about them. But in fairness to that, the book of Revelation and scripture in general, because Revelation is really the only passage that presents these guys in any specific explicit way, is fairly limited in its statements about the two witnesses, at least where it's directly speaking about them. So that's partially why I think the conversation about these two individuals is often so short. It's because there's half a dozen or a dozen maybe verses about them that appear to be about them in the scripture, and it doesn't really leave us with a whole lot if we're just going to stop with that and a few references to some other Old Testament verses that might be cited or invoked in Revelation chapter 11. But I do think that there is a ton of, and I'm exaggerating some, but I think by most standards, I think there is a lot more that Revelation has to offer us about these guys and their role than most people can get out of it. And I think part of that is because generally the case with the book of Revelation is that it by way of analogy, is sort of written as a 400 level course. Like if you think about college level classes, for those of us who had some experience with college or who have kids who are going to go to college, you start out with, the 100 level courses, right? Those are the entry level classes into any particular discipline or field or subject. And then you maybe take a freshman year class, and then you go up in your second semester, and the next year you take a 200s level and 300. So eventually you get to your 400s level classes or your doctoral level classes after that. And the book of Revelation, by way of analogy, in my opinion, is sort of written there's a lot of stuff that anybody can get reading out of it, but a lot of it is intentionally requires a certain type of mastery of other previous Testament, New and Old Testament references and information that you can not only see them, but you can find them when you can't see them. You can reason through the connections, and you can see the other connections that are made there that other people who maybe not develop the skills to study the scripture as well are not going to be able to get. They're not going to be able to see it. And it's not because the Bible's hiding these things. It's not because God is elitist about who he wants to see this. It's just that, as Jesus indicates to the disciples when he's teaching, and they say, well, how can you always teach in parables? Why is it difficult? And Jesus says, look, for those who want to know, they're going to get to see it, right? Like those who have, I'm going to give more. If you have understanding, I'm going to give you more understanding, because you're pushing in, you're hungering for it. But for those who are kind of nonchalant, non-committal, only looking for some entertainment, maybe they're not going to get the really good stuff, because they're not interested in it. It takes work to get really fulfilling understanding of any subject matter that's worth understanding, that has depth of knowledge. And I think that's how Revelation is. And I think that's how it is about these guys. So the book of Revelation intentionally veils information. Unlike other books of the Bible, it has that particular purpose, and it's shrouded in parables and symbols and stuff like that. Not because they're unavailable for us to understand, but because God's point of view is, if they're not really interested, if you're not really serious, if you're not going to come to the table ready to look and put some work in, you're not going to get all you can out of this. And I think that the encouraging thing for me is, if we put in the work, we can get some stuff out of here potentially. So I'm going to get into the basic stuff. At some point over the next few weeks, we're probably going to veer into some stuff that we haven't ever done in our studies as a group, or maybe only briefly or once done. So if you've studied if you look at our website, and it's organized sort of into different subject matters, there's an eschatology section. That eschatology section has three main component parts to it. One, which is called the symbol study, which is sort of like the most larger overview, basic information about symbols and the progression of history. Then we have a study called chronology, Revelation chronology, which takes a look at how the sequencing of chapters and events in the book of Revelation should be understood, and looks at different ways to do that, and offers up a potential way that we think is the best way to connect the different chapters and segments in that book in an orderly fashion with other stuff. Then we have a study called the premillennial temple study, which deals with what the temple is going to be like before it gets built, and largely is a historical look at where the temple specifically was located in the geography of Jerusalem. And then there is, so that's it, that and some of the miscellaneous material that's associated on there. There is an additional section that Brian and I have collected that we don't publish, because it's really in the weeds. Like if you've gone through the other studies that I just listed and you get bored to tears reading the premillennial temple study, or you get lost in the history, or you're bogged down in the Revelation chronology and some of the arguments there, this study would be just like, people wouldn't even want to touch it. But most of it is sort of just a refined look at some paths that were sort of set forward in some of the other studies that we've done. And I think we can talk a lot about them together. And I think some of it will deal with what I think Revelation has to say about the two witnesses. So that's my long introduction to this. What I want to do, just pause for a second. Anybody got any thoughts or questions before I move into the opening stuff for the material? Enoch?
I would say that the part that you said about the Revelation thing, I think is really true about maybe God has put some veils on that, where I wonder if it's almost though, not just for those that don't really want to hear it, but is there something in the spiritual realm and the enemy about God veiling some of this in his plan, to possibly not tip off the enemy or something?
I think that's a valid point as well. I mean, certainly the New Testament, when you talk about the way, things in with regard to Jesus his first coming and his ministry and his death and his resurrection, that God veiled those things. They're in the Old Testament. They're not always explicitly stated on occasion, but they're not a frequent matter of explicit conversation in the Old Testament. And part of that, there's two reasons for that are discussed in the New Testament or put forward in different places. One is so that the people who were didn't really have their heart towards God wouldn't see what was going on, right? So you have citations of passages like in Isaiah where their hearts are fat and their ears are, they're deaf. They won't see what God has put before them because they don't want to understand. They don't want to know. And then there's the fact that Jesus wanted to die and rise from the dead to bring about redemption. So he didn't want to tip his hand to that plan, to the satanic enemies, the devil and his angels, to try to thwart it. And there's some component of that I think is going on with the book of Revelation as well, as you bring up. So I think that's a great point.
It's ironic that the book of Revelation, having this kind of semi-veil over it, and the actual book is called, the Revelation, or the the unveiling, or whatever. It's
right.
Kind of interesting.
It's true. It is an unveiling of information about the future, and I think it is there to be unveiled. But we have to work a little bit to penetrate the veil and to see what's there. It's not openly stated. I mean, there's some things in there where they're intentionally left as a mystery, and in some cases we may not know till you live to see them. But in other cases, I think there's more than what people can often get at by just reading a popular Christian book or whatever about it. So let's start with some basics. First, I suppose we should start with reading at least a part of Revelation chapter 11, which is where the direct information about these individuals comes up. Revelation chapter 11, verse 1, and we're going to eventually visit sort of the material coming right before this and other stuff in the book, but this is where it starts. And in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1, John is speaking with an angel. The angel gives him a reed, think of like what we think of as equivalent to a yardstick, that he could use to measure for the purposes of survey work, for pre-construction activity for the area of the temple. This is in verse 1 and 2. And then as that discussion quickly comes to a close, the angel makes this statement in verse 3 of chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. And I will give power. That word power is in italics. It means it's not really there in the Greek. There are Greek words for power, for authority, for spiritual power, either the word dunamis or exousia, if you wanted to use the word authority. But here it just simply says, I will give. And then there's, by implication, he's giving something. And he says, so I will give unto my 2 witnesses, or I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So there's a period of prophecy, which is equivalent to roughly 3.5 years, if you do the math there on the number of days. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 candlesticks standing before the God of the earth. If any man wants to harm them, fire proceeds out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed, which is to say, sort of by the fire that proceeds out of their mouth. Verse 6, these have power to shut the heavens, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over the waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that ascended out of the bottomless pit will make war against them and will overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And the people of kindreds and tongues and nations will see their dead bodies for these 3.5 days, and will not allow their dead bodies to be put in the graves to be buried. And they that dwell on the earth will rejoice over these men's death, these 2 witnesses' death, and will make merry and will send gifts to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented them that dwell on the earth. And after 3.5 days, the spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood up on their feet, and a great fear fell upon those who saw them. And they heard a voice from heaven saying, come up here. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. Okay, so we'll stop there. It's hard to stop reading in the book of Revelation. You just want to keep going or whatever. But so that's the text, the body of information that people are drawing from largely. And there's some interesting things to get into here that we can do over the larger course of the study. But first, I want to talk about this central question that emerges. Are these 2 olive trees, these 2 candlesticks, the 2 witnesses, the 2 prophets? Notice those are 4 terms of reference that are used in this passage to identify whoever this is. 2 olive trees, 2 candlesticks, 2 witnesses, 2 prophets. Those seem to be interchangeable terms here, in the same way that that you might refer to me as Scott, you might refer to me as Mr. McPherson, you might call me, buddy or friend or whatever it would be, right? There's different manners of reference, all for the same party, in this case, the two witnesses. And so let's talk about what some of these terms mean. And the first question to ask that comes up is, most Christians will look at this and immediately think, I think with good reason, that this is a reference to two individual human beings. Now, there may be more to it than that, but that's sort of seems to be a default takeaway that people have from this. And I am not going to contend with that at all. I agree. I think that is the case. I think there's great reason to accept that this passage at least has in view two particular human individuals. I'm going to say human individuals just to be clear what I mean. And so I think all of those terms, two witnesses, two olive trees, two candlesticks, and two prophets, all refer to two individual humans. But there's a lot of questions that then surface about those two humans, where they come from, why are there two of them? And one of the questions that comes up is maybe that this is a reference to not two individual humans, but to two groups of people. That each group of people is one of these witnesses. So rather than referring to individual humans, these are referring to groups of people. And so one of the common ways that people have suggested, that those who have suggested it, is to suggest either that this is a reference to Israel and the church, like Israel is one witness, the church is another witness. Or you might see a slight alternative on that, like Gentiles and Jews. The Jews are one witness about God, and righteous Gentiles are a witness about God, which would therefore sort of transcend the Old Testament, New Testament framework of Israel and the church to some extent. Or you might see people say, well, it's the kings and the priests, like one of these guys is representative. If they're individuals, maybe one of them represents the kings and the other represents the line of priests. Or maybe it's a group of kings and a group of priests. And then another one that comes up from time to time, including one of the videos that Enoch sent over, is to take them as references to the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. So those two terms have a sort of historical parameter to them, right? Like in the modern world, we think of the state of Israel. We don't really divide it up into or think about the state of Judah or the area of Judah. When we think about the oldest part of the Old Testament story of Israel, we think about the people of Israel, right? When they came out of Egypt, there was just the people of Israel. There was 12 tribes, but they made up the descendants of Israel. It's only at a particular parenthetical period where what was the kingdom of Israel gets divided into two sections, one which is predominated by the tribe of Judah, and then those other tribes that are not associated with Judah become identified as the kingdom of Israel. And it's that period that we find many of the prophetic writings of the Old Testament. And so sometimes you'll see this discussion of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And so the idea here is that maybe the two witnesses are the nation of Israel. The kingdom of Judah is one witness, and the kingdom of Israel is another witness. And that's one of the ones that people have discussed. And sometimes you'll see people combine the individual concept with the group concept, so that there are two individuals and they are representatives of two groups. So like I said, maybe there's one individual who represents the kings of Israel and one who represents the line of prophets or the line of priests, maybe, or one guy who represents the kingdom of Judah and one guy who represents the kingdom of Israel, or one guy who represents Israel and the other who represents the church. So there's a sort of, you'll hear it said as the and or version of it. And so when we talk about the possibility of individuals, one of the questions that comes up is, if this is a reference that includes the existence of two individual persons, who are they? Are they contemporary end times humans who have never lived before? Or are they historical biblical figures who were alive in the past, who were brought back to the earth at some point in the future to play this important role before Jesus returns? So there's this sort of either or, historical biblical figures, or just happen to be humans who live in the end times, to people who've never lived before, who are important at the end times. And so among those two groups, when we look at the people who suggest that these are historical biblical people who lived in the past that God brings back, there are a couple of different options that people tend to go with. One is to suggest that this is Enoch and Elijah, that Enoch is one witness and Elijah is the other. Enoch and Elijah are both from the Old Testament period. Enoch from very early on, from before the flood, and Elijah as the major prophet of the Jewish people, at least as he was sort of conceived of. Or to have, instead of Enoch, you would have Moses and Elijah. And I wrote that wrong in the study, but Moses and Elijah as the two witnesses. And there's a couple of reasons for both of these guys. We'll get to those in a second when we discuss it. But I want to do some evaluation of these major concept theories about the two witnesses. First, with this question of group or individual, and then the issues about specific identifications of the possible individual theory. So one of the things that comes up when we're talking about the possibility of this being two groups of people, or at least that two groups of people are being represented, that the olive tree reference, the two olive trees, the two witnesses who are the two olive trees, is a representation of two different groups of people, is to look at places where olive tree is used in the Old Testament and see if that's any help to us. Now, I think that's a very smart move, is to let scriptural precedent, particularly precedent which uses similar language or concepts, to see if that is informative for us and intended to be part of our understanding as Revelation uses terms. And so one of the ones that comes up in one of the videos that Enoch sent out, and I think I've seen this before, is to refer to a passage in Jeremiah in which these things occur. So I got Jeremiah down here somewhere. Jeremiah chapter 11. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, right? Saying, hear the words of this covenant and speak unto the men of Judah and unto the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was the main city of the kingdom of Judah. And the Lord said to me, proclaim all these words. So I skipped from verse 1 to verse 6. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The Lord said, proclaim all these words in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. And in verse 9 it says, a conspiracy is found among the men of Judah and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And then in verse 10 he says, they have turned their back to the iniquities of their fathers, and they refused to hear my words, and they went after other gods and served them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant, which I had made with their fathers. So now, for the first time in this chapter, we have a reference to two groups. Before that, it was just Judah and its main city of Jerusalem. Now we have a reference to Israel and Judah. Now I want to pause and ask this question. I know our history and chronology of the Old Testament may not always be as sharp as we'd like it to be, but at the time Jeremiah writes, what are the status of those two kingdoms? Because remember I said there's only a particular window in the Old Testament where these kingdoms exist as two kingdoms. Where are we at in that time frame? Are we outside that parenthesis or in it? Hopefully you guys are thinking about this. Enoch?
Time period after Israel's already been separated.
Yep.
This is the point where the 10 tribes have severed off from the other two tribes, Benjamin and Judah, I think.
Yes.
Talking after a period after Solomon's son and the 10 tribes separated. So this would be looking at the 10 tribes of Israel compared to the 2 tribes.
That is certainly, this is after the point where the larger kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon has separated into the tribe of Judah, and then the other 10 tribes, which become the tribe of the kingdom of Israel. But I just want to maybe refine my question a little bit more.
Is Judah gone too?
No. But as Lou's implying, so we know there's a pending punishment coming with the Babylonian demolition of the city of Jerusalem and the depopulation of the land of Judah and taking captive all those and destroying their government, essentially. So that's one of the main themes of Jeremiah's prophetic ministry, is the coming destruction of the kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians, such that for a period of 70 years, with an included period of 50 years, where there's no kingdom of Judah at all. My question is, even though it's certainly the case that Jeremiah can refer to the concept of the house of Israel and the house of Judah, because the separation of of Israel as a country into those two separate smaller kingdoms had occurred hundreds of years before Jeremiah. As Lou's question implies, the kingdom of Israel did not exist at the time of this prophetic statement. Now, that's not definitive for our ultimate questions, but it is important to keep that in mind, that when we ask in a second, when we see Jeremiah use the phrase olive tree, which is one of those critical identifiers in Revelation, we want to know, okay, is Jeremiah providing a key to understanding how Revelation reference should be understood? And so, if you say, well, possibility the two olive trees refers to two groups of people. Here's a reference to two groups of people, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Let's keep in mind that even though Jeremiah makes reference to the house of Israel and the house of Judah, so far he's made repeated statements that God's commentary here that God wants Jeremiah to share is to the people of Judah and Jerusalem. And the reason for that is because Israel as a nation, as a kingdom itself, the 10 northern kingdoms, had already been destroyed. So they didn't exist. God wasn't speaking to them anymore. They had been separated. They had been taken captive. They had no leadership. There was no king. There was nothing left of the people of the kingdom of Israel at that time, for all intents and purposes. So God's not talking to them, which is why in the first 9 verses we see repeatedly God says, Jeremiah, go talk to Judah and Jerusalem. He doesn't say, go talk to Samaria, go talk to the northern kingdoms, go talk to Ephraim, which is another way of referring to the house of Israel. Because it was a historical past for them. It'd be like someone today referring to the Confederate States in the United States. That doesn't exist today. There's only one United States. There was only a brief window of time where this country was sort of separated into two factions. So to refer to that in the present of Jeremiah, there is no two houses. And then in verse 12, he continues, this is what's going to happen to Jerusalem and Judah. And he says, according to all of your cities were your gods. So you guys had one God for every city, right? And he says in verse 15, what has my beloved to do in my house, right? So he's talking about Israel, or his people, I should say. I'm careful not to use Israel. But his people here, the people of Judah, the remaining part of God's covenant people. He says, what has my beloved done in my own house? She's done wickedly. She's worshipped idols, right? That's what's going on here. And then verse 16, he says, the Lord has called thy name a green olive tree, fair and of good fruit. But the noise of a great tumult has he kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken. So this tree is going to be destroyed. Whatever the tree's in reference to. How many trees are there at this point? If you had to read this chapter so far, how many trees are there? Enoch's got one up there. I agree with Enoch. Hopefully you guys are all counting this in your head. There's only one reference to one tree here, even though this passage has an awareness of the two nations of the people, of the descendants of Jacob, into the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, if we want to use those terms. Verse 17 says, for the Lord of hosts has planted thee, and has pronounced evil against thee, meaning a calamity, a disaster, for the evil that you have done in the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So now there's a reference to both again. But if you continue, you see that you get down into verse 19, and it says, let us destroy the tree and its fruit. So I just want to be clear, when people invoke this passage, because of its use of olive tree, which we see used in Revelation as a term to describe the two witnesses, say, there's a reference to two groups of people here, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. The house of Israel did not exist at this time. This passage is directed only towards the house of Judah. It has historical reference to the people of Israel because both Israel and Judah had gotten in idolatry, and it was that which caused the destruction of both, but at different times. And at this time, Israel had already been destroyed. And so God's telling Judah, you're going to see the same fate because you're doing the same thing. And then God refers to his people as a green olive tree who will be destroyed in a singular sense. So even though you would expect that if this passage is talking about the existence of two trees, the people of Israel and the people of Judah, it would use plural, but it's very clear that it's using singular. So to me, that's not helpful. It's not what you would expect if this passage was intended to speak to two olive trees. We might be able to look at this passage and go, well, here's an example of one olive tree. If it didn't mention the house of Israel, that might be say, well, you could go from extension there and say, house of Judah is one olive tree. But because it mentions both, but it only mentions one tree, maybe it implies that Israel was another tree and that Judah is the only tree that's left. You could say that, that's possible, not closing the door on this. But I just want to say there's no mention of two olive trees here directly. It's very possible that what we're talking about is one tree, and the branches from Israel have been cropped off, and now the branches from Judah are going to get cropped off. And either one of those views is possible. Go ahead, John.
I was also going to say that the nature of the relationship between this olive tree and the Lord at this point in time is not in good standing, right? So that would add additional information about this that doesn't either will be adding, we would get more insight into the nature of the two witnesses, or this would be a disqualifying attribute to say, all in addition to the other one, singular, that that might show that we're not referring to the same olive tree type of thing. We won't. Maybe there's more detailed information, but
sure. Well, and I think to what you're getting at, unless I don't want to step on your point, if you got more to go there.
No, it's just that just because there are similarities between two things doesn't mean it's a reference to the same object. So
right.
The one that you always hear me say is when people refer, and I don't care who it is, I'm not trying to get political here, but if somebody refers to somebody as Hitler, it's not because they wear shoes, right? They both wore shoes. There are some attributes that are very unique to that individual that I think would be pertinent to the discussion. So that's all I'm saying about this. And
true. And I do think that this meets at least this criteria that there is some sort of seemingly unique or at least not often applied use of the reference by analogy to an olive tree that occurs both in this passage and in Revelation, which does warrant, I think, the sort of consideration that others have put forward. Hey, maybe this passage has some helpful information for us about Revelation. But it's important to be aware of all of the potential similarities and differences and what olive tree, the green olive tree, is intending to symbolize in either case, right? Like, why pick an olive tree? What is relevant to an olive tree that speaks towards witnessing, to being a witness? And we can get down that path at some other point. But in this chapter, the only thing that seems apparent about the olive tree is its pending destruction. And that's not something, maybe you said, well, the two witnesses die, they're going to get destroyed, so maybe that's why God invokes the olive tree. I don't think that's the case, but let's think about what olive tree might be referencing. And I don't want to get into that path completely now, but I see Enoch's got something he wanted to say. Let's go with Enoch first, and then John.
Go ahead, dude. Yep.
Piggyback on that, what you were saying there with the one single olive tree, even in verse 16, Yahweh called thy name a green olive tree, fair and goodly. With the noise of a great tumult, he hath kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken, meaning implying that there has been some damage already to this olive tree already, and some of the branches are broken, and speaking past tense, meaning that could have been one of the Israel, before broken already, that this one single olive tree was already damaged by it already. And like I said, my wheels are spinning because Paul talks about these branches were broken off, and that whole concept of when something broken off of a tree, because of certain reasons, because of their disobedience, maybe that's this one single olive tree, and then now Israel has already been one of the branches that were broken or something.
Yeah, John, what were you going to say?
What I was going to say is that when I was using discussions about like Hitler and what were the attributes of him, you have to have at least killed some people and predominantly Jewish people. In this situation, the olive tree is actually a reference to something that was beautiful or is in a particular state. So if I'm looking at the two witnesses and they're being referenced as an olive tree, if I were to make any comparison, it would be Judah when it was doing well, right? So I think the calling something an olive tree is more likely to be something where you're saying that these are representative of me and following me and doing something well as an attribute rather than a specific indicator of a particular object, as in a group of people.
Well, I think people who use this passage as an aid to understanding Revelation, or who want to do that, do think that that's the case, that the olive tree, just to short circuit this part of it, is that the olive tree, which is an agricultural means by which they got oil from the fruit, the olive, and then they would press it and use the oil to make lights. So it was a way of providing light to the people of Israel, which there's an analogy for that in the New Testament and elsewhere. So the idea of giving light and giving witness, I think, are tied in that way, that the tree was a desirable tree, that it was representative of Israel. There was a ton of these in the land of Israel at one point in time. And then, so Enoch kind of referred to this. I want to go to this next, which is Romans chapter 11. One of the things that this citation or investigation of Jeremiah invokes, and I think rightly so, is the question of we should look for places in the Bible that talk about olive trees, especially in a figurative or analogy way, because that's what's going on in Revelation. So we want to know, does the Bible do this before? How does it do it? Maybe that's helpful. But the question then comes up is, if we're going to do that, let me ask it this way: should we conclude that any passage in the Bible that mentions olive trees, especially in a metaphorical context, is therefore relevant to understanding the two witnesses? Is that a valid approach, that any passage in the Bible that mentions olive trees must be relevant to understanding the two witnesses? Hopefully you guys are thinking about that, and you know that, yeah, the answer is by implication no. It may be that a passage that uses the reference to olive tree, especially if it's doing so in a figurative or a metaphorical way, that may be relevant, but simply the presence of olive tree. This is what John's own comparison to Hitler. By the way, we're gonna have to draw a rule about the number of times someone can use that as a reference, but I get your point as well.
There's a law about this.
It's an easy way to describe or explain something, but just because a passage mentions olive trees, even if it does so in a metaphorical way, does not necessarily mean that the author of Revelation, or God who gives the information, Revelation to John, intends for any other passage to be therefore part of our understanding. It may, and I'm going to give you guys some examples of this going forward. But if we are doing this, which I think is good to do, and we're talking about whether Israel or the house of Israel, the house of Judah, is one of these olive trees, then we can look at passages in the Bible, like in Jeremiah 11, and see if there's any other ones where Israel is referred to as an olive tree. And we will find at least one other, which is in Romans chapter 11, and this comes up in this discussion, although I don't think it helps people the way that one of the authors of the videos thought it did. But in Romans chapter 11, just to do the short version of this, Paul is discussing the people of Israel, the Jewish people in the first century, and then the Gentiles who had come to faith in this Jewish Messiah. And he talks about them by way of analogy, saying in verse 17, you Gentiles who've come to believe in Jesus are like a wild olive tree, right? So you weren't cultivated. There's no farmer coming out to water you and to prune you. You're just out there growing in the wild. And you were branches from that wild olive tree, and you were grafted in. So that's a sort of agricultural term for putting part of you can do this with plants. I'm not capable enough to do this, but I know it's done. To take a branch from one kind of tree, an apple tree, and you can attach it to another apple tree. I think you can even do this with related kinds of trees, but apple tree to apple tree, just for my analogy, and make that branch, which was from an entirely another tree, grow in and connect with and become a live living part of a separate apple tree. And that's what Paul's saying is happening here, that the Gentiles who were part of this wild olive tree, they were branches of a wild olive tree, have been made a part of the cultivated olive tree of Israel that God cultivated, right? He had crafted and pruned them and worked with them over centuries. And so they now participate, he says, in the root of the olive tree that is Israel. Now, he hasn't said Israel yet in this passage. Earlier, he references it, but if you keep going, as he goes through this explanation, He says in verse 24, as he's saying to the Gentiles, hey, don't be cocky just because you don't get conceited, just because you've been brought in and now you're accepted in the tree of faith, that those parts of the tree originally that didn't have faith, that were broken off. Notice that's a similarity to Jeremiah right there. The branches that are broken off because they weren't operating in obedience and in faith. He says, just because you're in and they're out, don't get haughty about that and proud, because he says, how much more those branches which were broken off, the natural branches of that tree, can be grafted into their own tree. Now, in one of the videos, if I'm not mistaken, the author implied here that there were then two trees. There's the original Israel tree, right? Because he mentions here in verse 25, Israel and the Gentiles, right? So there's this idea of here, one of these trees is the Israel, and the roots of that tree are the patriarchs, the fathers of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, being the person named Israel originally. And so they're the roots of this tree, and then the nation that grows out of them is this olive tree that's cultivated by God. And then out away from that, somewhere else, is the righteous Gentiles, which Paul discusses earlier in Romans 1 and 2, who are just do what's right by their understanding of nature and considering things and what was revealed by creation. And those Gentiles through Christ are now brought to be a part of this tree that is rooted in the patriarchal lineage of the people of Israel. And then he says, but there were some branches that were naturally part of that tree of the patriarchal nation of Israel that didn't have faith, that have been broken off because they didn't stay in faith. And then Paul says in this process here that those branches that were broken off, the natural branches from the tree of Israel, can be grafted into their own tree. My takeaway from that, and there's two possibilities of what that means, is that they are grafted back into their own tree. But one of the authors in the video, unless I had to rewind this 2 times to try to understand this, it sounded like he was saying that he thought those branches that had formerly been a part of the natural tree of Israel and were broken off would now be crafted back into a separate olive tree, their own new olive tree, so that you have 2 trees, the original tree of Israel connected to the patriarchs, and then the secondary tree of Israel constituted by all the branches that had previously been broken off but now returned to faith. That may be possible linguistically or reasonably. It just doesn't seem like the most reasonable option that Paul's making, which is, seems that Paul's saying you were from some other tree and God put you who were foreigners into his own people's house, and those who were cast out can be brought back into that house if they would only turn to faith. Not that they'll be put into a separate house that will be a new house of faith. So here in this passage, I only see one tree of Israel. Now there is the wild olive tree, but if you ask this question, between the wild olive tree and the cultivated olive tree of Israel that's being discussed here, how many of those trees are in good standing with God? Do you want to remain part of the wild olive tree? John, what do you guys say?
I was going to say no. So originally, when we were talking about olive tree in context of the other passage, it was a time when they were doing well and they were no longer doing well. They were no longer having that, whatever that attribute was. Right. Here again, we see that olive trees used, but there's this additional adjective of good versus wild, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a sense of something that is not maintaining the aspect of the good olive tree is being cut off, mm-hmm. and that part of the wild olive tree that potentially is compatible with the goodness of this other tree is being grafted in, and at some point, the branches that were part of the original tree, something changes about their status such that they're grafted back in. That's the way I would kind of see this happening. So again, the aspect of whatever you're being grafted into is this singular tree that has this root, and whatever that root is the primary thing that's driving whether you're a part of it or not, right?
Yeah,
and that's the good part.
Enoch, did you have a comment? Yeah, I agree, John.
I was thinking back, and I did the same thing. I rewound it a few times with this part where they were talking about if there was another tree, and I was like, that's not what the passage says, and I had to look this up again and read it, right? Because I'm not seeing it says that, and I've always read it as if they're going back into their same tree. I think that was the whole point. I've always thought that. I guess I've always thought that it read they can be grafted back into their own olive tree. Maybe that's some versions translated that way. but actually in the King James Version, it actually doesn't say that, but I think that's what he implied,
Right.
that they're grafted in. There is only one olive tree that they're going back in and going in, but there is two olive trees in this story. I mean, Paul is talking about two different olive trees.
Right.
One is wild tree, and one is this good tree that John was talking about here. So there is two trees here, but the tree that you're coming off the wild tree is not the one you want to be on.
Yeah. You wouldn't think that the book of Revelation, God's talking about the two witnesses, and one of those witnesses is equivalent to the olive tree that you don't want to be a part of. that doesn't work very well. Go ahead, Enoch. I know I stepped on your.
The last thing I'm just going to say is in this verse 24, where he says into a good olive tree. I think Paul purposely uses that language because the passage that you just looked at in verse 16 that I just read, God says you were an olive tree, a good olive tree. So that was the title of the tree that he had said when they were in good standing, like John was saying. So he uses that very same language. And I bet you if we were to look at the Septuagint, it's probably the same.
Yeah, I think Paul's certainly aware of Jeremiah 11 when he writes this. But the difficulty for me here is that, yeah, this passage, especially Jeremiah, but it may be of relevance as well, seem to have some promise. They're talking about God's people who were a nation that was supposed to witness to the truth and preserve the truth of God. Israel had the tablets of witness, the covenant of witness, right, of testimony. But there's never any point where the scripture seems to clearly depict this as two. And there's really only one tree in the Old Testament that Paul's referring to by reference here in Romans, that is Israel, one olive tree that's good. So that presents a bit of a problem with Revelation. You'd have to then say, well, one of the trees in Revelation is Israel and the other is the church, but that would have problems directly with Romans, where Paul's saying the church is merely Gentiles grafted into the original tree. So this raises the question that go ahead, John.
I was just going to add one other thing, which is if the pattern were to hold up, and you've got this one tree, this good olive tree, of which some branches were cut off, and they're being established now as their own good tree. Why are the wild branches? Why are the parts of the wild olive tree being grafted into this other olive tree? Yeah. Why wouldn't they be a part of their own tree? Right. To me, the pattern, if the pattern is independence, then I would expect both groups, those from the wild one and those that were cut off, would form into their own trees. But if one branches are being cut off so that other ones can be grafted in, then I would expect the pattern being that those ones that were cut off are being grafted back into that one. That keeps the similitude of the metaphor.
Yeah, I know we could dissect. I don't want to hit too hard on this guy's point of view on this, but I just wanted to show first that I don't think his interpretation of Romans, it certainly requires more explanation as to why he thinks that's the interpretation of Romans to go with, or Jeremiah to go with. But I think there's plenty of reasons to suspect that he hasn't really nailed the landing on this. And I want to add to this, brings back to this question I had, which is every passage that mentions an olive tree in the Bible, particularly if it does so by analogy or figuratively, necessarily relevant to Revelation? And the answer is not necessarily. No, we shouldn't assume that it has something to say about that. And I want to give you a couple of examples to that effect. John, what were you going to add?
I might say, though, potentially every reference to a good olive tree or an olive tree whose attributes are good may be a reference to the same object.
Yeah, that certainly would want to say if it has other similarities. But let me give you guys a couple of examples of this. So if you don't want to just stop with the first verse you find, and stop with Jeremiah 11. You can look up and see. There's ways to do this, right? You can look up olive tree in English or olive trees in English in a Bible search software. You can go and look at the Hebrew words that are used in those passages and then look up searches with those words and see what other passages come up. You're not going to get a ton of stuff. There's references to olive trees in literal reference, and there's a few references to this in a figurative way. But you wouldn't want to just stop at Jeremiah or Romans maybe just because you found an example of something that is an olive tree being used to refer by analogy to people that are good. That would not be a valid or reliable way to go about studying Scripture. If you're onto something that analogies to olive trees might be relevant, you want to find all of them and decide which ones may or may not be relevant or figure out what it's telling you about Revelation. So I want to give you another example. This is Psalms chapter 52. It's not a very long chapter, 9 verses. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You know, he's talking about the wicked who boast in their mischief and they work deceitfully, and that what God's going to do to them, he's going to pluck them out. And then he says in verse 7, but let me just go to verse 8. He says, but I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. Oh, okay. Now we have olive tree referring, in this case, to a specific individual who is righteous as an analogy. Seems to fit at least as much of the pattern as Jeremiah, maybe even more so, because Revelation seems to have some implications. We'll have to evaluate this, that it's talking about individuals. But if the author of this is David, which is generally considered to be the case, then do we have to conclude that David is one of the two witnesses in Revelation? Or the other alternative is that we now learn something about the use of olive tree as an analogy, which is that it's a way of referring to God's righteous people as individuals or maybe as groups. And then we'd have to say, well, which is Revelation talking about? Individuals or groups or both? But we wouldn't want to just stop with, here's an example in Jeremiah of it being used to apply to a group. Therefore, Revelation is talking about groups, because we haven't taken into account the other relevant factor, which is here in Psalms. We have an example of it being used to talk about the righteous king, King David. So that may be relevant, but it certainly undermines the conclusiveness of the idea that Revelation is only talking about groups of people, or that it's in talking about Israel, because then we'd have this choice of either the two witnesses are King David and the nation of Israel, right? That seems problematic. So we just got to dig deeper and try to refine our questions as we probe more information. And I got one more verse that I know it's just about 8 o'clock, but I got one more verse I want to at least get to on this particular point tonight, and it's in Judges chapter 9. So this is easy enough to do. Do word search for olive tree in the Old Testament, see what you come up with. So this is an example in Judges where there's this statement being made. It says, the trees went forth on a time to anoint a king over them, right? So this is already an analogy about trees. And they said to the olive tree, why don't you reign over us? And the olive tree said unto them, why would I leave my fatness, wherewith by they honor both God and man, and go to be promoted over the rest of the trees? So the trees went to the fig tree and they said, why don't you reign over us? And the fig tree said, why would I forsake my sweetness and my good fruit and go be promoted to over the rest of the trees? So the tree said to the vine, why don't you come reign over us? And the vine said, why should I leave my wine, which cheers God and man, and go be promoted over the trees? So they went to the bramble and they said, you reign over us. And then the bramble said, well, if in truth you anoint me king over you, then come and put your trust in my shadow, right? And so here we have this analogy. Let's see if they give us a little bit more information. Verse 16. Now, therefore, this is what you have done truly and sincerely, and that you have made Abimelech king, and you have dealt with Jerubbaal and his house in this other way, right? So this analogy is a reference to people. And I would say Abimelech appears to be the bramble, but that would mean that the other trees represent other people that could have been candidates or choices to be king, which fits more the pattern of Psalms where David is king and is an olive tree. Doesn't fit the group context that others have tried to derive from Jeremiah 11. And my point being that it's very premature to just go to Jeremiah and say, oh, here's one, this must be relevant, story done, concluded. There's obviously more to it than that. And so I will, let me look at my notes here and see if there's any other points I want to make on this before we finish tonight.
Were you going to, maybe you'll do it later on the study, are you going to look at the I think, Zechariah passage?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got a lot more ground to cover here, even in this opening set of basic material. So, you know, that's enough to get us to at least through this initial question, which is how is it, do we have good reason to think that, and this, I just want to refine this issue. If we're saying groups of people versus individual people, the real way to refine that question is, does Revelation not refer to individuals? That it's only referring to groups? Because if the book of Revelation intends to refer to individuals who somehow are representative or leading of groups, that's fine, but we still have a really important piece of information, which is that there are two individuals that are in view in Revelation. Whether those two individuals are meant to be representative of kings and priests, or Israelites and Gentiles, or some other thing is important, but we already answered the important question, which is individuals are in view here. So the real question is, we're looking for scriptural reason to suspect that it is not a reference to individuals at all, that it's only a reference to groups. And I would say that at this point, and again, we've got more analysis to do, but at this point, we really haven't found the scriptural basis for wanting to be conclusive that this is only a reference to groups, that the two individuals are not in view or intended in Revelation chapter 11. And again, we'll keep going on this in weeks ahead. So I'm going to pause there and just let you guys, if you have questions or other comments, we can do that before we do prayer requests, and then I'll stop the recording. Any other thoughts on this stuff tonight? Again, we will talk more about it next week, so you can hold your fire till next week if you want.
I'll throw in a little precursor, which I assume would be coming up, is there's some other descriptors in Revelation that was talking about plagues.
Oh, yeah.
And so there'll be some, questions about, are there groups doing plagues or individuals doing plagues, right?
Yeah, we
That
got a
might be
lot of
another
other
way
material to work through.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. We'll cover that all.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say that, yeah, definitely that this olive tree, clearly there's a lot of references to it in different passages, like you said, that don't always apply to that particular topic. And I agree that there is more, like John was referring, some really individual things that have to take place in the passages of Revelation 11 for those individuals that really can't really be done in a group aspect. I mean, you really have to stretch those analogies of what's happening there quite a bit. But I am interested. The one that kind of stumped me a little bit was the Zechariah one, where he is saying these are the two olive trees. But that we'll get to that later. That's the part I'm questioning about or not.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have to look at Zechariah as we go forward. So a lot more to talk about on this. And we can go pretty deep on this study. Even tonight it was intended sort of as the opening, and we didn't get too far. So we can obviously spend some time talking about this. So, all right, if there's nothing else, I'll stop the recording, and then we'll do prayer requests. Let's see how.
I was going to say one thing that's probably not necessarily related to this topic, but it is, but it's not exactly what we're talking here. But the placement of the two witnesses, and I don't know if you'll even get into that, but some of those videos, I think they had it wrong where they were saying it was the first half, but we believe it's in the second half, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about when they're active, and I think they're active in the entire 7-year period. But the role that Revelation 11, verse 3 and forward, particularly start talking about plagues and such. I think that's second half, final 3.5 years. I do think in the first 3.5 years they are doing some stuff, particularly related to the building of the temple and some other things, but there's a lot more we can get into, and I think that will be important, is to talk about when they're doing certain things, and we can go through that. All right, big study ahead. All right, let me stop the recording. We'll do prayer.